Welcome to the Part S channel. Today we explain Numbers chapter 30 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're going to dive right into the text, looking strictly at the plain meaning, what the words actually say, without getting sidetracked. So just to ground us for a second, where are we in the story? Well, the Israelites are right there, standing on the edge of the Promised Land. They're preparing to enter, and right before they do, Moses pulls the heads of the tribes aside to lay down some incredibly foundational rules for their society. And this whole chapter, it focuses entirely on one major theme, the absolute power of our words, our vows, and our pledges. It basically functions as a strict legal code for how ancient Israelite households manage promises.
To really understand this chapter, we first have to wrap our heads around the profound, absolute weight placed on spoken promises in the ancient world. The verse we're looking at right now sets the tone for literally everything else we're about to read. Think about it. We live in a world of digital signatures, complicated written contracts, and legal notaries, right? But back then, the spoken word was the ultimate binding law. When a person spoke a commitment out loud to God, it was locked in. There was no casual backing out. There was no fine print to escape through. Your word was an unbreakable bond. It was a sacred contract. The text fully expects that you will do exactly what proceeds out of your mouth. It's almost like they treated speech as a physical action, something that literally alters reality the moment it leaves your lips.
So, here is our agenda for this highly organized legal code. 1. The power of vows. 2. Daughters and fathers. 3. Newlyweds and vows. 4. Widows and divorced women. 5. Wives and husbands. And finally, 6. Lessons on keeping words.
Section 1. The power of vows, establishing the baseline. Let's look at verses 1 and 2.
Okay, so the chapter opens with Moses speaking directly to the heads of the tribes. He's laying down the fundamental, unbending baseline rule. If a man makes a promise to God, he simply cannot break his word. But the text uses some very specific Hebrew terms here, and we really need to clarify them to grasp the plain meaning of what's happening. First, we have a nether, which translates to a vow. Now, a nutter usually went promising to do something positive for God. For example, promising to offer a specific animal as a sacrifice, or maybe donating some property. Then we have the second term, an isar or shavua, which means a binding pledge or an oath. This is a bit different. This meant taking on a restriction, actively denying yourself something normal, like taking an oath to fast or abstaining from certain types of food. So by speaking a netter or an isar, you are creating a strict, inescapable legal and spiritual obligation for yourself, simply by vocalizing it. You are, in the text's literal phrasing, afflicting the soul and binding yourself. It is serious business.
So that establishes the rule for a man. His word is entirely autonomous, he's solely responsible for it. But what happens if a young woman makes a vow? How does the text handle a young woman who is still a dependent living under her father's roof? This brings us to a really fascinating question about how these strict rules actually operated within the complex, interconnected households of the ancient world.
Section 2. Daughters and fathers, the household hierarchy. Verses 3 through 5 outline the rules for unmarried daughters.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the text impartially breaks down the father's veto power. And to understand why a veto was even necessary, we have to look at the plain, practical reality of ancient life. Imagine if a daughter made a rash needer, a vow, to give away a huge portion of the family's livestock to the sanctuary. Or maybe she makes an isar to fast intensely, right in the middle of the critical harvest season when everyone's labor is desperately needed. That kind of promise could literally threaten the entire family's survival and economic stability. So the rule is laid out like this. If the father hears her vow and says absolutely nothing, his silence acts as full consent. Her vows stand permanently. But if he disallows it or forbids her on the exact day he hears it, the vow is completely nullified. And the text specifically assures us that the Lord will release and forgive her simply because her father forbade it to protect the household.
Section 3. Newlyweds and vows, transitioning households. Verses 6 through 8 address a woman moving to a new husband. The biblical text is so thorough, it leaves no gaps in a person's life stages. It moves logically right into the next phase. What happens at the very moment a woman gets married? If a woman marries while she still has a vow, or maybe just a rash, binding promise she lets slip from her lips, the text outlines a very specific transfer of oversight. Let's imagine the literal scenario here. A young woman made a pledge while she was still living with her father. Maybe he never heard it, or maybe he heard it and chose not to veto it. Now she's crossing the threshold into a brand new household with her new husband.
She is literally carrying this pre-existing spiritual and legal obligation with her, taking it right from one domain into another. And just like the father, the new husband gets a one-time opportunity to nullify that vow. But here's the catch. The time frame is intensely strict. The Hebrew phrase used here is b'yom shema'o, which translates to on the day he hears it. He doesn't have a week to mull it over, He doesn't get to wait and see how her fast plays out for a month. The moment he finds out about this rash promise she brought into the marriage, he has a choice to make that very same day. If he holds his peace, the vows stand permanently. But if he forbids her on the day he hears it, he makes her vow void. The authority to protect the new household stability has simply transferred to the husband. And if he voids it, the text is clear, the Lord will release her. Now, you might be wondering, how does the text handle women who fall completely outside of this traditional ancient household hierarchy? We've talked about fathers, we've talked about new husbands, but what about a woman who has no male head of household overseeing her affairs?
Section 4. Widows and divorced women. Absolute binding obligations. This brings us to verse 9.
This single verse is amazing because it gives us a remarkably clear picture of legal autonomy in the biblical text. The text states incredibly clearly, any vow or obligation taken by a widow or divorced woman will be binding on her. Her words cannot be vetoed. Period. The vow stands firmly against her. So for an independent woman, her vows carry the exact same unvetoable weight as a man's. In this biblical legal code, a widow or a divorced woman operates with full legal autonomy. There is no father to overrule her, and there's no husband to nullify her decisions. Whatever she binds her soul with is her absolute responsibility. It really highlights a profound level of individual accountability when it comes to her spoken word.
Section 5. Wives and husbands, the established household. Let's move on to verses 10 through 15.
Okay, so now we are looking at a woman who is already fully settled in her husband's house. She's not a newlywed crossing the threshold. She's established. And she decides to make a binding oath to afflict the soul. The text carefully clarifies the mechanics of the husband's veto here, basically reinforcing the standard rule we've seen. An immediate objection voids the vow, and God forgives the wife. But once again, his window of opportunity is incredibly narrow. If he hears it, he must act immediately to protect the established household from whatever obligation she has spoken. If he doesn't act immediately, he must forever hold his peace. This verse right here explicitly cements the ancient legal principle that passive silence is treated as an active yes. The Hebrew phrase used is mi yom el yom, meaning from day to day. If a husband altogether holds his peace at her from day to day, meaning he literally lets the sun go down on the day he hears the vow and lets it pass into the next day without saying anything, he has officially confirmed it. He has caused all her vows to stand. He cannot casually claim a week later, oh, I actually disagreed with it in my heart at the time. No way. In this legal framework, if you do not actively object, your silence is a binding confirmation. However, verse 15 introduces a truly fascinating penalty and a deep theological concept. What if a husband initially stays silent, but then later tries to nullify the vow? The text says he must bear her iniquity. This transfers the guilt of the broken promise entirely onto himself. Let's break that down. Say he hears the vow on Monday, says nothing, but by Thursday he decides it's inconvenient and forces his wife to break it. Because he missed his legal window, by Yom Shema'o, the exact day he heard it, the vow was technically binding. So what does it mean in the plain reading of the text to bear her iniquity? It means the spiritual consequence, the actual sin of breaking an oath to God, lands squarely on his shoulders. He becomes the guilty party, not her. Why? Because he overstepped the strict legal boundaries of his authority. Section 6, Lessons on Keeping Words, Practical Takeaways. Verse 16 wraps up these statutes. The text formally concludes the chapter by reminding us that these are the regulations the Lord gave Moses. But by looking closely at this ancient framework step by step, we can extract 3 timeless, highly practical lessons to improve our own integrity today. First, we need to recognize the sheer weight of spoken commitments. Even though we live in an era of digital contracts and texts, your word should still be your bond. When you say you will do something, treat it as a sacred obligation. Second, avoid making rash or impulsive promises. How often do we commit to things in the heat of the moment only to totally regret it later? This chapter teaches us to pause. Consider the reality of your commitments before you vocalize them. Save yourself the psychological weight of failing to deliver. And third, understand the profound responsibility of your consent or your silence. Just like the households we read about in the text, sometimes saying nothing when you really should speak up means you are actively accepting and binding yourself to a situation.
Your silence speaks volumes.
As we wrap up this explainer, consider this final thought on the enduring power of keeping our word. If your words were permanently binding today, if you could literally never back out of a casual promise once it left your mouth, how carefully would you choose them? It's a profound question that this text forces us to ask ourselves about our own honesty and integrity. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.